My son, I never thought I'd live to see the day when my own flesh and blood would turn their back on me. The words echoed in Sophia's mind as she sat in the dimly lit room, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the wall. The funeral was over, but the pain lingered. David, her beloved husband of 43 years, had been laid to rest just hours ago. And yet, it wasn't his absence that haunted her most. It was the absence of her son, Jason. Her heart ached as she replayed the heartbreaking conversation she had had with him earlier. It was the day before David's funeral, and Sophia had been making all the necessary arrangements, picking out the flowers, organizing the service, and trying with all her might to hold herself together. She had been so focused on David's final journey that she hadn't expected to feel such a deep stab of betrayal from her son. It wasn't the first time their relationship had been strained, but this was different. This time it felt like the final straw. Sophia had always believed that no matter what, family came first. She had raised Jason alone after David had passed, away unexpectedly from a heart attack when Jason was just 16. Sophia had worked tirelessly to provide for Jason and give him the best life she could offer. There were sacrifices, of course too many to count, but it had always been worth it because she had him. But now, at the most vulnerable point in her life, Jason had chosen something else over her. The phone call had come in early that morning, just as Sophia was making her way through the house to David's office to check the details for the funeral. Her fingers were trembling when she picked up the phone. "Mom?" Jason's voice had been distant, the sound of a party in the background muffling his words. It didn't take long for Sophia to understand that Jason wasn't calling to check on her, to ask how she was holding up. No. Instead, his tone was more casual, more indifferent than she had ever heard. "Jason, are you coming tomorrow? Your father, he's gone. You need to be here," Sophia had said, trying to keep her voice steady. "We need you. I need you." Jason paused on the other end of the line, and for a moment, Sophia thought she might hear him say something comforting, something that might make everything feel right again. "I know, Mom. I'm sorry," he had finally said, his voice flat, almost emotionless. "But Lisa's birthday is tomorrow, and I promised I'd be there for her. She's really upset, and I can't let her down." Sophia's heart skipped a beat. For a moment it felt like time had stopped. The words Jason had just spoken hung in the air like a weight she couldn't escape from. His father's funeral, his own flesh and blood, was nothing compared to his wife's birthday. And the worst part was that he said it so casually, without hesitation, as if he couldn't see the gravity of the situation, as if it didn't matter that David had been a part of his life for over 30 years. "I can't believe this," Sophia had whispered, the hurt lacing her voice. "I know, Mom. I'm sorry. I really am. But it's just the way things are. I'll call you later, okay?" Jason's voice was distant again, as if the conversation were over. And just like that, the call had ended. Just like that, Jason had chosen her, his wife, over his own mother in the most pivotal moment of her life. Sophia stood frozen in the center of her kitchen, her grip tightening around the phone. She had been through so much in her life, but this was a betrayal she hadn't seen coming. This wasn't a teenage rebellion or an argument over some trivial matter. This was a son who had abandoned his mother, his own family, in favor of a birthday celebration. The next day, the funeral had proceeded without Jason, and Sophia found herself surrounded by extended family members, friends, and colleagues, all offering their condolences, their support. But no matter how many people were there, it didn't ease the pain. She had spent so many years dedicating herself to Jason, giving him everything he needed, only for him to turn his back on her at the funeral. Sophia had tried to focus on honoring David's memory, but her mind kept drifting to Jason's absence. The harsh reality of what had happened was impossible to ignore. There, under the clouded sky, surrounded by the gravestones of the past, Sophia realized something she hadn't been willing to admit before. Jason was no longer the son she had raised. The day dragged on. The mourners came and went, and the final goodbyes were said. But when it was over, when the last of the flowers had been placed at David's grave, Sophia found herself standing alone in front of the grave, her heart heavy with sorrow. As she turned to leave, she caught sight of the one thing that still held meaning for her. The family portrait taken years ago, when Jason was just a boy. She had it framed and hung on the wall of her living room. It was a memory of a simpler time when their bond was unbreakable. But now, that portrait seemed like a lie. Sophia's eyes welled up with tears as she walked back to her car. The road ahead of her seemed longer than it had ever been, filled with uncertainty. She didn't know what the future would hold, but she knew one thing for certain. She would never look at Jason the same way again. As the days passed, the calls from Jason became less frequent. At first, he would call and leave apologetic messages, saying how sorry he was for missing the funeral. But as time went on, the apologies grew fewer. Sophia could tell that the rift between them was only widening. Every attempt to bridge the gap was met with resistance, and she began to wonder if it was even worth trying anymore. It was clear to Sophia now. Jason had made his choice, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't change that. But what hurt the most was that she had once trusted him completely. She had given him everything: her time, her love, her sacrifice, and in return she had hoped for the same loyalty. But now, she was left with nothing but disappointment. With a heavy heart, Sophia made a decision. She would no longer keep putting herself through the pain of waiting for a son who had chosen to abandon her. It was time to take control of her own future. "I changed the will," she said to herself one evening, staring at the papers before her. "You'll get nothing. Not a single thing." The decision felt final, like a weight lifting from her shoulders. It was painful, yes, but it was also freeing. For the first time in months, Sophia felt like she had regained control over her own life. No more sacrifices. No more endless giving. Jason had made his choice, and now she would make hers. Sophia sat in the dim light of her study, her fingers gently tapping on the surface of the desk. The room around her was quiet, almost too quiet. She was used to the noise of life, the hustle and bustle of people, the commotion of family. But now, after David's death and Jason's betrayal, the silence felt deafening. It was as if the world had shifted, leaving her standing in the middle of a vast, empty space. Days had passed since she'd made the final, painful decision to change the will. Jason's name had been struck from the document, and in its place, her charity fund had been named the primary beneficiary of everything she had worked so hard for. It was a decision she hadn't taken lightly, but it had been necessary. The world had a way of breaking you down, she thought, of testing your limits. But sometimes, you had to fight back. The love she had given Jason had been unconditional. She had put him first in everything, sacrificing her own needs, her own desires, to ensure that he had a better life. But in the end, he had shown her that it was all for nothing. Sophia tried not to think about it too much, but the guilt gnawed at her. She had changed the will because Jason had chosen to be absent when his father was laid to rest. Yet there was a part of her that wondered if it had been the right thing to do. Could she have handled it differently? Could she have let him off the hook, given him another chance? No. The thought was fleeting, and Sophia immediately pushed it aside. Jason had made his choice, and now it was time for her to move on. But moving on didn't come easily. The days dragged on, and each one felt like a battle. There were moments of weakness, moments when she longed to pick up the phone and call him, to hear his voice, to ask him why he had done this. But every time she thought about it, she remembered the coldness in his voice when he had explained that Lisa's birthday was more important than his father's funeral. And the sharp pain returned. She couldn't forgive that. She wouldn't. Weeks passed, and the distance between them only grew. Jason had stopped calling altogether. The occasional text messages were short, almost impersonal. She didn't need them. They didn't even make her feel better anymore. They only reminded her of how much had changed. The son she had raised, the son she had poured her heart into, was slipping away from her. She wasn't just losing him as a son. She was losing him as a person. There was no more warmth in their interactions, no more caring. It was as if Jason had turned into someone else, someone unfamiliar. And that realization was what hurt the most. At night, when the world was quiet, Sophia would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, thoughts swirling in her mind. She thought about all the sacrifices she had made for Jason. She had always believed in family. It was the one thing that had always kept her going, even when life had been difficult. But now, she found herself questioning everything. What was the point of giving everything if it was just going to be taken for granted? Was family truly everything, or had she simply been fooling herself all along? But in the midst of this turmoil, something began to shift within her. Slowly, she began to see a new path opening up. If Jason didn't want to be part of her life, if he had made it clear that his priorities lay elsewhere, then it was time for her to focus on herself. She had spent so many years nurturing him, taking care of him, that she had lost sight of her own needs and desires. It was time to reclaim that. She didn't need Jason to be happy, and she certainly didn't need his approval. Sophia started filling her days with things she had once enjoyed, things she had put aside for far too long. She took up gardening again, something she had always loved but hadn't had time for when she was consumed with taking care of Jason. She went to the local library, diving into books on history, philosophy, and art. She spent afternoons in the park, watching the birds, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face, and enjoying the peace that only nature could bring. She also began reconnecting with old friends, people she had lost touch with over the years. It felt good to talk to people who had no expectations, no judgments. They listened, they understood, and they didn't ask her for anything. She realized that she had been so focused on being a mother that she had forgotten to be a woman, a person outside of her role as a caretaker. Now, as the months passed, she found herself rediscovering parts of herself that she had forgotten existed. But just as she began to rebuild, Jason resurfaced. It was a cold autumn afternoon when the doorbell rang. Sophia wasn't expecting anyone, and when she opened the door, she was met with the last person she ever thought she'd see standing on her doorstep. Jason. Different. He was dressed in a dark suit, his hair neatly combed, but his eyes had a haunted, desperate look. He looked worn, as if life had taken a toll on him. The sight of him made Sophia's heart skip a beat. Despite everything, despite the way he had hurt her, there was still a part of her that cared. "Mum, please, I need to talk to you," Jason said, his voice cracking. Sophia studied him for a long moment. She had thought about this moment for months, had imagined what she would say, how she would react. But now that it was happening, she felt a strange calm. She wasn't angry anymore. No, that was gone. She had been angry for so long, but now there was only sorrow. Sorrow for the relationship that had been broken. Sorrow for the man her son had become. "I'm not going to forgive you, Jason," she said, her voice steady. "Not yet. You chose your wife over your own father's funeral. You chose her over me. I can't forget that. Jason's face fell, but he stepped forward, almost pleading. I know, Mom, I was wrong. I was blinded by everything. By her. By my career. I made the biggest mistake of my life, and I've been living with that guilt every day. I don't know how to make it right, but I want to try. Sophia's heart ached as she watched him struggle to find the right words. The man standing in front of her wasn't the same boy she had raised. He had changed, whether by choice or by circumstance. He was no longer the son she had known. I don't know if you can make it right, Jason, she said softly, her gaze drifting to the family portrait on the wall. The damage is done. You left when I needed you most. I know, Jason whispered, but I'm here now. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm really sorry. For a moment they stood there in silence. And then, as if some invisible force was pulling them together, Sophia reached out and hugged him. It wasn't a full embrace, but it was enough to convey that, despite everything, she hadn't completely given up on him. Let's take this one step at a time, okay? She whispered. Jason nodded, tears filling his eyes. He had no idea how much this meant to him, how much this small gesture might be the beginning of a healing process that he had never expected. But in that moment, as Sophia held her son, she realized something important. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning. They had a long road ahead of them, but at least they were on it together. Sophia sat alone at the kitchen table, the fading light of the evening casting long shadows across the room. She had just finished dinner, something simple, a salad, some homemade bread, but the food had barely touched her. Her mind was consumed by everything that had happened, everything that had led her here. The conversation with Jason had been an unexpected turning point, one she wasn't sure she was ready for. She glanced at the clock. It was just after 8 p.m. It had been 3 days since Jason had come to her door, and for the first time in months, she found herself actually considering what he had said. But considering it didn't mean forgiving him, not just yet. Jason's return had stirred emotions that she thought had long been buried. The anger she had carried for months over. His absence at David's funeral still flared up every time she thought about it. But there was also something else, something more complicated than just anger. It was a kind of sorrow. A deep, gnawing sadness that came from the realization that her son was no longer the man she had raised. He was a stranger to her, and the hardest part was admitting that she was no longer sure who he was. The week since the funeral had been a whirlwind of emotions. But it wasn't just Jason's absence that had left a mark. It was everything that had led up to that point, the years of sacrifice, the quiet resentment she had felt growing inside her, as she poured everything she had into raising him, only for him to choose his wife's birthday over his father's. Final farewell. Yet, despite all of this, Sophia couldn't help but wonder if there was a way back. Could they rebuild their relationship? Was there any hope for them? Or was their bond irrevocably broken? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the phone ringing. It was a number she didn't recognize. She hesitated for a moment before answering. Hello? Sophia? The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, but somehow it felt oddly reassuring. It was her lawyer, Margaret. I'm calling about the will. Sophia's heart skipped a beat. The will. The decision to change it had felt like an act of finality. A line drawn in the sand. Jason's name had been crossed out. The charity fund had been made the primary beneficiary of her estate. There was no going back now. Yes? Sophia replied, her voice steady but her heart racing. I think we need to revisit the will, Margaret said, her tone gentle but firm. There's something that you might not have considered. You've named your charity as the sole beneficiary. But what if we approach this a bit differently? Sophia was silent for a moment, her mind racing. What do you mean? Your decision to change the will. It was a direct response to what happened with Jason. And I understand why you did it. But there's more at play here, Sophia. You've built something incredible, a legacy. Your company, your work, everything. But it's not just about the money or the property. It's about the meaning behind what you've built. Sophia sat back in her chair, the weight of Margaret's words sinking in. She had worked her entire life for the legacy she had created. Baxter Printing was her brainchild, the business that had taken years of hard work and sacrifice to grow. And yet, when she looked at the business now, all she could see was an empty shell of what it once was. The only thing that had truly mattered was the people in her life, the family she had built. And now, with Jason gone, what did it all mean? Margaret's voice broke through her thoughts. I think you should consider leaving a portion of your legacy to Jason. Not everything, of course, but something. He may have made a mistake, but he is still your son. And, more importantly, he's still part of the family you've worked so hard to create. Sophia closed her eyes, her mind swimming with conflicting emotions. She had never imagined herself in this position. Jason had hurt her so deeply. And yet, here was someone telling her that she should still consider him as part of the family. Could she do that? Could she truly open her heart to him again? For the first time, Sophia began to understand something she hadn't fully realized before. Her decision to remove Jason from the will had been driven by pain, by a sense of betrayal. It had been a way of punishing him, of making him pay for the hurt he had caused her. But it wasn't just about punishment. It was about power. And now, she realized that she didn't need that power. What she needed was closure. She needed peace for herself and for Jason. The next few days passed in a blur. Sophia met with Margaret to review the details of the will, to decide what could be done. Jason's name was still on the documents, but the terms were being revised. A portion of the estate would go to him, but it would be contingent on certain conditions that would hold him accountable for his actions. She wouldn't just hand him everything. He would have to prove to her that he could be trusted. Again. But there was more to it than that. Sophia realized that this wasn't just about money or property, it was about legacy. Her legacy. The things that mattered most in life were the relationships you built, the people who loved you and whom you loved in return. And no matter how painful it had been, Jason was still her son. The evening before the will was to be finalized, Sophia stood in front of her bedroom mirror, staring at her reflection. She was no longer the woman she had once been, the woman who had sacrificed everything for her family, the woman who had given up her own happiness for the sake of others. She was someone different now, stronger, wiser, and yet she felt a deep, aching sadness that couldn't be ignored. In the morning, Jason came to see her again. He arrived early, his face tired, his eyes still filled with regret. But this time, there was something else there, a glimmer of hope, a spark of realization that maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other. "Mum, I know I've messed up," he said, standing at the threshold of her living room. "I'm sorry for everything. I've been selfish and I don't know how to fix it. But I'm here and I'm willing to try. Whatever it takes." Sophia's heart clenched at his words. She had wanted to hear this for so long, but now that it was here, she wasn't sure what to do with it. "I changed the will," she said quietly, her voice steady but heavy with emotion. "And I've decided to leave you something. Not everything, but a portion. But you need to prove to me that you can be trusted, that you can stand by your family, no matter what." Jason's eyes widened, and for a moment he looked as if he might cry. "I'll do whatever it takes, Mom. I'll show you. I promise." Sophia nodded, a small, fragile smile crossing her lips. I'm giving you this, Jason, not because I expect you to change overnight, but because I want to believe that you can, and that maybe, just maybe, you'll remember what really matters. The days ahead would not be easy. The road to healing was long and uncertain, and Sophia knew it. But as she looked at Jason standing before her, she realized that perhaps there was still a chance. A chance for forgiveness. A chance for redemption. And maybe, just maybe, a chance for them to rebuild what had been broken. Sophia closed her eyes, the weight of the decision lifting from her shoulders. It wasn't about the money, the estate, or the legacy anymore. It was about family. It was about love. And with that she made a silent vow to never again let bitterness overshadow the love that had once existed between them. It was time to start over.